G'day and welcome to the show. Last week we road tested freshwater turtles and the eastern water dragon. This week we'll be pointing our cameras at Australia's largest and most successful group of reptiles, the skinks. Numbering over 370 species, skinks are the only Australian lizards that give birth to live young, but not all of them do. In the southern parts of the country, where low temperatures make external incubation difficult, species have evolved to become mostly live bearers. In the warmer northern regions, they have adopted egg-laying as a strategy. Such amazing adaptability has not been a small factor in their great success. Most Australians are familiar with the large and conspicuous blue tongues, but there are hundreds of smaller species that differ from each other only in the tiniest of details. Later we'll meet some of these, but most have not been, nor will they ever be, popular as pets. One of the largest and most bizarre members of the blue-tongue family is the shingleback. With tortoise-like speed, it lumbers through the dry, arid southern half of the continent. If you come across one of these lizards in the wild and approach closely, the first thing you'll notice is the typical open-mouthed threat display. This is simply bluff, as the lizard has no real means of defending itself. If that doesn't work, to survive an attack, it must then rely on its tough scales and a tail that could be mistaken for a head. In ecological terms, the shingleback is the closest reptile Australia has to a tortoise. Blue tongues also occur in New Guinea and have managed to colonize several surrounding islands. The Solomon Islands monkey-tailed skink is the largest of all skinks and has adapted to an arboreal or tree-living way of life that is greatly assisted by a prehensile tail. This fascinating species is popular with keepers in America. I visited Darren Croft in Chicago, who showed me his giant skinks.
One of my favorite animals are the prehensile-tailed skinks. People call them monkey-tailed skinks too. They're really interesting animals. One of the nicest things about them is that they're really easy to feed. Unlike a lot of lizards where you have to feed them live foods, these just eat the same things I do. Lots of vegetables, greens, and they love tomatoes. This is a pretty ripe tomato, so I'm going to cut it up here and we'll see if he's in an eating mood. Let's go find out. This one is one of the female skinks here, and sometimes she's in a good mood to eat, and other times not. Usually tomatoes is one of their favorite foods. Let's see if she is interested. They use their tongues a lot, and there you go. You can see that's just how they eat, and she'll take it out of my hand and usually try to start eating it bit by bit. When they eat a big leaf, they start on one edge, and then they just keep munching their way down until they have the entire things in their mouths. This is Hank. Hank's the male, but he's usually more interested in getting out of the tank than he is in eating. But with a tomato, he might just be interested enough to eat it. Well, there you go. Even though they're plant eaters, you definitely don't want to get bitten by one of these animals because they've got really strong jaws for eating all the tough plant food that they eat. In the wild, they mostly eat leaves of vines, but of course when they come across a fruit, which is basically what a tomato is, they get really excited about it. These are prehensile-tailed skinks, which means they can grab onto things with their tails, and you can see Hank, he's hanging down. That's because he's holding on with his tail. Chameleons have the same sort of prehensile tail. They also call them monkey-tailed skinks because monkeys, a lot of them, have prehensile tails. And they're from the Solomon Islands, which is an island over in the Pacific near Papua New Guinea. And so these are really unique for skinks. Most skinks that you see are smaller animals that have very small legs that tend to run around in the underbrush, but these are made for living in the trees. And that's why they have these tails that they can grab onto branches with. They have very big claws, very big sharp claws, so they can climb right up a tree really, really easy. These animals are interesting because they just have one baby, unlike a lot of lizards, and it's live born. They don't lay an egg or anything like that. It's, in essence, hatched internally.
Like monkey-tailed skinks, shinglebacks also give birth to one or two very large young after a gestation period of about 5 months. In this rarely seen mating display, observed just by chance and filmed on a mobile phone, the normally slow-moving male and female shingleback put on a burst of speed. The male chases the female and literally holds her down by biting her. He then mates, and the whole process is over within seconds. A pregnant shingleback will begin to show signs of imminent birth when her breathing becomes deep and laboured. Just before birth, she will raise her back legs and contractions will stimulate her to push the baby out. It appears to be very difficult and probably quite painful to get such a huge baby out, but the reward is an offspring that is so well developed it is likely to survive. Once the baby emerges, it will immediately begin breathing and start tasting the air with its tongue as it gets acquainted with the outside world. As with all blue tongues, baby shinglebacks are born attached to a placenta which emerges after them. This is a very valuable source of nutrition and moisture, and the baby's immediate instinct is to eat it. This may seem a bit yucky to us, but its natural environment is harsh and dry, and food supply is by no means guaranteed. To waste such a resource in times of drought could mean the difference between life and death for a baby. In captivity, baby and mother should be offered a drink of water, which they will readily accept. Shinglebacks are unique among lizards in that they display a certain amount of parental care. In the wild, it is not uncommon to find babies up to 12 months of age still with their parents. Shinglebacks occur in many regional colour forms right across Australia. From the typical black forms across the east coast to the more patterned varieties such as this one filmed crossing a road near Perth. Possibly the most sought after variety is the colour phase, which occurs in the goldfields of Western Australia, much prized for its yellows, reds and oranges. There is even an albino in captivity in Australia, which has the potential to produce some very interesting lines. In the wild, shinglebacks feed on fruit, berries, leaves, fungi, insects and snails. In captivity, they can be offered a variety of foods including dog or cat food, green-leafed vegetables, fruit, meat, mushrooms and insects. A calcium phosphate supplement should also be part of their diet. The most familiar large skink to people on the east coast of Australia would be the common eastern bluetongue. This species can produce up to 20 or more small live young. Another less commonly encountered species is the alpine or blotched bluetongue, which produces only about 6 or 8 larger babies. This is a comparison of the newborns showing the blotched bluetongue and the common eastern bluetongue. Alpine or blotched bluetongues make great captives as they can withstand low temperatures and will happily spend the winter outside. They are also quite attractively patterned, easy to maintain, and they rarely bite. Gravid bluetongues, like this blotched bluey, will give birth after about 5 months of pregnancy. As with shinglebacks, the approach of birth is signalled by periods of heavy laboured breathing. This female produced 5 healthy babies within the space of about 15 minutes. And the babies actually began to compete with each other to eat the placenta. Such is the high value of this resource. Baby blotched blueys should be offered water and then food within hours of being born, and they will most likely eat and drink. They will also instinctively hiss and gape at their keeper, but this is only because they are expecting to be eaten by anything larger than themselves. Don't forget the mother, as she will most likely be thirsty and ravenously hungry after losing so much condition during the pregnancy.
I would normally feed animals like this on a diet of cat food with a mixture of fruit and vegetables, and occasionally fuzzy or pink mice would be a good way to put condition back on a female after giving birth. Just get one out. That's an adult male. She's about 5 years old, and this is a sub-adult female. Differences are in the sexes. Males tend to be buffier headed. Their heads are very large as opposed to a female. You can see there a female's petite, so to speak. Longer sort of body, elongated body on a female. Although this male's big, the males tend to be skinnier at the hips and females are wider. There are two forms of blotched blue tongues found in Australia. There's the lowland form, which is this one here, and also the highland form, which is this one here. They both are lovely animals and just as easy to keep as one another, but the highland form seems to be the more desirable animal on the market at the moment. This is one of my Centralian blue tongues. Half the fun of keeping these animals is trying to breed them, and with blue tongues, especially with this species, it can be quite challenging. I've managed to so far breed western blue tongues. My next big challenge is going to be try to breed these. These guys now are just over 3 years old, so hopefully after a winter cooling I'll be able to attempt trying to get these to breed for me. I'm just sieving sand here with cat litter scoop, which I've melted some aluminium fly screen wire into it to sift sand and sift all the shed skin and droppings. And I do that on a regular basis. It helps a lot to keep them clean. The whole lot should probably be changed, I would say, every month. That helps keep it nice and clean. With keeping a lot of reptiles, in order to keep them properly fed or give them that variety that they crave, I keep quite a lot of woodies in tubs, and I keep my woody colonies like so. They've got places to live, food and water, and they're doing quite well. Blue tongues can be very enthusiastic feeders at times, especially when it's with things that they really love, such as insects, snails, or even if you feed them, mice. The thing with feeding them insects in particular is if you're going to feed them insects, feed them with a pair of tweezers, such as this. Put your insects on the end, grab hold of the insect and offer it to the blue tongue. That's a far better way than throwing insects in there, and they'd probably be too quick for the blue tongue to catch most of the time. And if you're keeping the blue tongues in groups, you'd probably end up having fights due to them getting so excited they're trying to catch the insect they might bite one another. So I prefer, if I'm feeding any live food, I normally just feed them with a pair of tweezers. It takes a bit of time, but it's fun. Okay. Here you go. No? Still on it. This is a year-old northern blue tongue skink. As you can see, they're quite hefty. They actually can grow a lot bigger than this. Fully grown, a northern blue tongue would probably reach 60 centimetres long, which is quite a hefty animal. Same sort of diet as other blue tongues: vegetables, fruit, insects, mice, and cat food makes up a mainstay. And they do quite well on it. Now I'd like to show you some of my western blue tongue young, which a female of mine gave birth to 5 healthy babies. I feed them every day on cat food, vegetables, some fruit, and they seem to really like young mice, and they're doing very well. I give them vitamins and calcium at least twice a week, as they are growing very fast.
Like shinglebacks, blue tongues get a bit frisky during the breeding season. Also filmed opportunistically by a breeder on his mobile phone, this video shows a pair of western blue tongues mating. Again, the male subdues the female by biting her and then trying to hold on. The female struggles, not because she is trying to get away, but because she is testing the strength of the male. and will only submit to a powerful, healthy male that can control her and thereby guarantee healthy offspring.
I believe that blue tongues make excellent beginner pets. They're very interesting and so easy to care for, which is one of the reasons I began keeping them as pets. They're also very good for kids, as they are quite easy to feed, become quite used to being handled, and don't bite unless they feel threatened. In fact, I can't think of any reptile that would be a greater pet than a blue tongue.
I tend to keep species that are a little less run-of-the-mill. I'm not particularly into breeding of colour morphs. It's more for me breeding small species that are a little more challenging, things that haven't been bred before, or things that have been bred very infrequently. There's not a lot of market for those sorts of animals other than other enthusiasts, but from that point of view it also gives you the opportunity to swap and exchange animals over time. Because there's not a big money value in it, it's also a group of animals that are sort of self-sustaining. You've got 2 or 3 dozen people that are interested in those. It's not something where they're suddenly going to flood the market and nobody wants them anymore. So there's something that it's always worthwhile keeping them in the system. Down here on the bottom row we've got some prickly forest skinks, one of your rarest skinks in captivity. They're a rainforest species from North Queensland. This one here, they like to have submerged themselves in the water bowl. So very prehistoric little things. This is actually a gravid female. She's got a big fat belly. They're a live bearer, usually anywhere between 2 and 5 babies at a time. But yeah, quite a pleasant little skink. Very heat sensitive and very dehydration sensitive. Their enclosure dries out. They'll sort of desiccate very quickly, usually within a couple of hours, so you have to keep them in pretty much a moist environment all of the time, and even then they'll sort of seek out their water bowls when they're feeling a bit dry. But yeah, quite a pleasant species to keep.
Like the prickly forest skink, many other small species of skink also give birth to live young. But unlike the blue tongues, they take a more active role after the birthing process. This common eastern water skink, which would be familiar to most people living on the east coast, is heavily pregnant and just about to give birth. As the time approaches, she turns around and bites her own leg. This seems a bit curious. But what she is actually doing is checking if the baby has already emerged and has mistaken her leg for the baby. The actual birth is over within seconds, and she immediately grabs the baby in her mouth and literally shakes it free of the birth sac so it can begin breathing. Babies will begin feeding on crickets within a day or two.
So what we've got here is Egernia mcphii, species from northern New South Wales. So it's one of your Egernia species, one of your smooth-scaled Egernias. Egernias are quite nice skinks to keep. They do tend to be a bit aggressive. You've got to be very careful when you're pairing them up. Once you've got male and female, however, they're quite devoted pairs and they do get on rather well. Now, this is Egernia striata, one of your arid zone burrowing species of skinks. It's just at the entrance to its artificial burrow there at the moment, feeding on some termites. And like all of your Egernias, they're a live bearer. Mine routinely have 2 to 5 young, usually in the first week of February every year. Most of your burrowing species tend to be far less aggressive than the spiny tail forms of Egernia, and they still do prefer to be in pairs but rather than groups. But if you leave their young ones with them, they'll form lovely little family parties. Now, this is your Kimberley colour variety of the northern blue tongue, which is Skinkoides intermedia. Typical of the Kimberley form is this sort of salt and pepper effect over the head. and a general loss of patterning in the centre of the back. One of the largest forms of blue tongues. This is a big female, and this is her somewhat smaller male. And these guys originate from Prince Regent Sound in WA. She's got a big belly full of babies at the moment. They normally give birth February, March, so she's still got quite a way to go yet. And you can see the little scars and that on the back of her head, which are mating scars where she's been grabbed. Also a few scars over the top of the shoulder where she's been grabbed during mating. These are one of your probably more handleable pets, much more suited to someone who wants to be a little more interactive than you would with, say, geckos or skinks. And these guys are quite happy being handled, and they're also quite adaptable with their food supply. They're just as happy with fruit and veggie mix as they are with things like snails and large insects. Kimberley blue tongues are moderately uncommon in captivity still. The eastern blue tongue, which is the other subspecies of this particular type, very common in the pet trade, and probably one of the species most suited to the pet trade, in that you really can't do much wrong with a blue tongue lizard. They're not as prone to calcium-based problems. Their diet is a lot more adaptable. So overall, they're quite a good pet species from that aspect. This is Cyclodomorphus casuarinae, the she-oak skink, very rare in captivity, very highly sought after. Related to the fairly common pink-tongue skinks. This is adult size, they don't get much bigger than this. Relatively plain on the back, beautifully patterned on the underside. A lot of people think that the name casuarinae comes from the fact that their patterning looks a little bit like your casuarina seed pods, but it's actually named after one of the boats in the Bowden expedition when they were first identified. So it actually has nothing to do with its preferred habitat or its appearance. This is Cyclodomorphus gerardi, the pink-tongue skink. Another heat-sensitive species, but very good one in captivity. If handled regularly, they tame down quite well. When they're not handled, they do tend to be a bit on the cranky side. As you can see his little pink tongue there. Closely related to the blue-tongue skinks, very adaptable in captivity. Okay, this is your Gidgee spiny-tailed skink, Ergonia stokesii. A little bit more robust than your Cunninghams and your Hosmers, a lot thicker. Similar sorts of problems. They are quite aggressive, they're quite difficult to sex, but a little bit more outgoing than some of your other species. They tame down quite well, are happy on a diet of fruit and veggies and a little bit of meat-based diet, as well as a few insects. But overall, yeah, a very pleasant species. They're a live bearer. They have 2 or 3 babies at a time. Usually January, February, most babies are born. And yeah, we're quite happy there. They're technically more of a arboreal species, living in tree hollows and things like that, but are quite happy in a ground-based enclosure as well.
In this episode, we've road tested blue tongues and shinglebacks, both of which can make great pets. But what if you can't choose between the two? I guess the answer would be a shingle tongue. But seriously, hybrids do occur in nature, and of course are much more likely if different species are kept together. This curious beast is a cross between a shingleback and its closest relative, the common eastern blue tongue. It has the head, scales and colour of a shingleback, but the shape and tail of a blue tongue. Crossing any species of reptile is not something I would encourage, but I guess it's only human nature to mix and match a little bit, and the results can be interesting and sometimes quite bizarre. The road test results for this episode produced the following scores. For the shingleback, newborns go for about $150 each, so on price I gave them a score of 8. The shingleback is regularly bred in captivity, but has a very low reproductive rate, so a 7 seems right here. Generally, shinglebacks present few maintenance problems if given adequate heat, so a score of 6. Unlike most other blue tongues, shinglebacks don't do very well if kept in outdoor enclosures outside of their natural range. They are sensitive to higher humidity and will develop respiratory problems if kept outside along the east coast of Australia. They therefore require extra heating, so electricity bills will be higher than for the blotched bluetongue, a score of 5 for garaging. Providing a balanced diet does require some effort, but shinglebacks will conveniently eat most foods, a score of 5 in the fuel category. Wow factor. Some of the West Australian morphs are quite beautiful, and selective breeding is improving some of the more common colour morphs, so a wow factor score of 6 seems right here, giving a total score of 37. Now for the blotched bluetongue. Newborn blotchies go for about $100 each, so on price I gave them a score of 8. The blotched bluetongue is regularly bred in captivity and produces up to 8 young, so a score of 8 on availability seems right here. Blotchies are a low maintenance pet if kept in an adequate sized enclosure, a score of 8. Blotchies do very well in an outside enclosure and can be kept outside all year round. They will also happily live in an indoor enclosure, a score of 7 for garaging. As with the shingleback, providing a balanced diet does require some effort, but they will conveniently eat almost any food, a score of 5 in the fuel category. Wow factor. Blotchies score higher than the common bluetongue, but they are still a pretty familiar lizard, so a wow factor score of 5 seems right here, giving a total score of 41.